Welcome to the series on the executive partnership between the CFO and the CEO. And there are three components to this series, or three parts rather. Part one will be the CEO CFO partnership in how to integrate the top-down and the bottom-up planning process. Now we know that this is one of the most important partnerships and the most critical partnerships rather in an organization. And especially during the planning process, it becomes even more important. I want to start saying this. If the CEO and the CFO, they are not aligned on the planning approach, the entire process will fail regardless of how good your methods are. That's the reality. I've observed planning processes fall apart because the CEO and the CFO, they were not working as true partners. Sometimes the CEO sets the aggressive top-down targets without even consulting the CFO on the feasibility or anyone else for that matter. And sometimes the CFO gets so focused on financial constraints that they don't understand the CEO's strategic vision or the point of view. Sometimes they present different messages to the leadership team, they create confusion, and some of the functional leaders, they can play the CFO and the CFO against one another. So the planning process only works when the CEO and the CFO, they operate as a unified leadership team with complementary roles that reinforce each other. So let me give you a personal example. I was advising a company where the CEO announced to the board that they would grow 100% next year. They didn't even consult the CFO. The CFO was completely blindsided and shell-shocked and privately thought it was 100% impossible given the cash constraints and hiring timelines. But now the CEO had already committed publicly, so the CFO felt forced to either support an unrealistic target or undermine the CEO. You see where I'm going with this? This is exactly backwards. Here's how it should have worked. The CEO and the CFO should have discussed a strategic ambition together before any board commitment. They should have modeled what 100% would require. What is the amount of investment levels? This is the next series of videos on the partnership between the CFO and the CEO. And you know that, you being a CFO, you know that. That partnership is extremely critical for the success of this role. How the executive partnership drives planning and success and organizational alignment is what we are specifically going to talk about in this particular video series. In this particular part, however, we're going to talk about integrating the top-down and the bottom-up planning. And we're going to be covering that in other videos in the series. The CFO-CEO is one of the most critical partnerships in any company. The relationship between the CEO and the CFO during the planning process is extremely important. Is sacrilegious. I want to start by saying this: if the CEO and the CFO are not aligned on the planning approach, the entire process will fail. Regardless of how good your methods are, it doesn't matter. And I've observed planning processes fall apart because the CEO and the CFO, they were not working as true partners. Sometimes the CEO sets the aggressive top-down targets without consulting the CFO on the feasibility. And sometimes the CFO gets too caught up in the financial constraints without understanding the overall CEO's strategic vision. And they present different messages to the leadership team, creating confusion, and sometimes even allowing the functional leaders to play them against each other. The planning process only works when the CEO and the CFO operate as a unified leadership team, and with complementary roles that reinforce one another. So let me give you a personal example. I was advising a company where the CEO announced to the board that they would grow 100% next year. They did not even consult the CFO first. The CFO was blindsided and privately thought 100% was impossible given the cash constraints and the hiring timelines. But the CEO had already committed publicly, so the CFO felt forced to either support an unrealistic target or undermine the CEO. And this is exactly backwards. Here's how it should really have worked. The CEO and the CFO should have discussed a strategic ambition together before any board commitment was made. They should have modeled what 100% meant and what 100% would require, what type of investment level, hiring timelines, operational improvements. They should have pressure tested the feasibility together. Then they should have either committed jointly to 100% or agreed on a different number they both believed in. So when the CEO and the CFO are aligned before engaging the broader team, everything else becomes easier. Everything. Let me walk you through the framework for an effective CEO CFO partnership and planning. So phase one, there's a strategic alignment that has to be considered. Strategic alignment before the targets is set. The CEO and the CFO, they need to align on strategic priorities before you set any financial targets. The CEO brings a strategic vision where we are trying to go, what we are trying to achieve, and what success looks like. The CFO, on the other hand, they bring the operational and the financial lens. What is possible given the constraint? What trade-offs are we making? What risks are we assuming? And what happens? This conversation goes somewhat like this. The CEO says, I want to establish market leadership in the enterprise segment. That's a strategic priority for the next year. Fantastic. So the CFO responds, okay, help me understand what market leadership means quantitatively. What market share? What win rate against key competitors? And what would achieving that position enable us to land strategically in terms of pricing power, better talent attraction, or easier fundraising? Well, the CEO says, if we become the clear category leader in enterprise, we can command premium pricing, we'll attract the best talent, and will be the obvious acquisition target, or perhaps even be an IPO candidate. I think we need 30% market share to establish that position. Okay, the CFO says. So let me model what the 30% requires in terms of revenue growth and customer acquisition. I'll come back to you with what that implies for investment levels and timeline. And then we can decide together if it's feasible or if we need to adjust the ambition of the timeline. Notice what has happened. They are having a conversation. They are aligning. They are aligning on strategic intent before discussing the numbers. The CEO is articulating why the growth matters strategically, not just saying we need to grow fast. And the CFO, notice the way he questions stuff, is translating the strategy into financial implications, maybe into unit economics in his mind. They're problem solving together. Now they move on to phase 2, where they are taking a joint development of the top-down framework approach. Once you're aligned on strategy, the CEO and the CFO should build the top-down planning framework together. Not the CEO setting targets and throwing them to the CFO. And then the CFO building models and presenting it to the CEO. No. They work together. They question the assumptions together. So I recommend a structured session where the CEO and the CFO, they work through questions like, what is a revenue target that achieves a strategic objective? What does that imply for growth rate, for market share, for customer acquisition? What are the key assumptions we are making with respect to market conditions, competitive dynamics, execution capability? What investment levels are required? What does this mean for cash flow and financing needs for the company? What's our confidence level in achieving this? And what are the major risks? So by the end of this session, you should have a top-down framework that you both own and believe in. It's not the CEO's plan or the CFO's plan. It's your plan together. It's our plan, let's say. You move on to phase 3, where you create a division of labor in gathering bottom-up inputs. Once you have the top-down framework, you now need to engage the leadership team in bottom-up planning. The CEO and the CFO should divide responsibilities clearly. Very clear demarcation lines here. Here's a decision I've observed that works the best. The CFO leads, not the CEO, but the CFO. Process design, facilitation template, creation and guidance, bottoms-up submission templates, collecting that information, doing the first round of financial analysis, doing all the modeling, doing the scenario modeling, doing the gap identification, quantifying the gap. And then the CEO leads. They provide the strategic context communication. They reinforce strategic priorities with functional leaders. They address concerns about strategic direction. And they make the final calls on strategic trade-offs. Now, both jointly, one-on-one discussions with each functional leader, one-on-one. And they're doing it jointly, not singularly. They are negotiating gaps between the top-down and the bottom-up, decision-making on resource allocation, and presenting the unified plan to the board. The key is, why are they doing it together? The key is that the functional leaders see the CEO and the CFO, they are aligned partners, so they're not separate power centers they can play against each other. You see what I'm saying? So the CEO, CFO meet every leader one-on-one. Weekly CEO, CFO check-ins during planning. Planning takes approximately 8 to 12 weeks, as I discussed in the top-down planning series. Throughout that period, the CEO and the CFO should have weekly one-on-one check-ins and stay aligned. And this is what it means. Here's what these check-ins cover. What bottoms-up input have we received? What is surprising or concerning? Where are the biggest gaps between the top-down targets and the bottom-up plans? Which function leaders are struggling with the targets and why? What negotiation strategies are working or maybe not working? Could there be strategic pivots we need to consider based on what we are learning from the ground? Are we still aligned on the final plan direction? And so these check-ins, they prevent the CEO and the CFO from drifting apart or developing different perspectives on the plan as new information comes through, as emerges. In phase 5, what you're doing is you're presenting a unified front to the leadership team. And this is so critical. Once the CEO and the CFO have agreed on something, whether it's initial top-down targets or response to a functional leader's concern, or even the rollout of the final plan, they must present it as a unified decision. I've observed functional leaders try to triangulate. They will push back to the CEO, then go to the CFO, and hoping for a different answer. Or they'll complain to the CEO and separately to the CFO if they feel that either one of them are being unreasonable. And if the CEO and the CFO are not aligned, this creates chaos in the company. So the rule should always be, if a functional leader disagrees with a planning decision, they should raise it with both the CFO and the CEO together. The CEO and the CFO should discuss it privately, align on the response, and deliver that response jointly. No end runs around one or the other. So let me give you an example of how this unified front might work. The head of sales, they push back on the revenue targets, saying it was totally unrealistic. So he goes to the CFO privately and said, the CFO doesn't understand how the sales work. Instead of sympathizing, the right CEO would say, okay, let's get the CFO in the room right now and work through our concerns together. The three of them sat down. The head of sales explained his concerns about capacity and ramp time. The CFO explained the strategic imperative for an aggressive growth. The CEO said, I'll hear your concerns. And I also need you to understand that the strategic context is very important for the future of the company. So let's model what it would take to get closer to the target. So all of them are now modeling scenarios together. They found a path that sales believes in, and now they are emerging more aligned than before. The head of sales never tried to play them against each other again because he saw that they were truly partnered. Let's move on to phase 6, joint decision making when there's disagreement. Sometimes, like anything else, the CEO and the CFO will disagree during planning. The CEO might want to be more aggressive than the CFO, and the CFO is more prudent and more conservative. So the CFO might want to constrain spending more than the CEO thinks is strategically smart. So when this happens, don't paper over the disagreement or let it simmer. Address it directly, but respectfully. Here's how I've seen effective CEO-CFO partnerships handle a disagreement. Here's an example. So a CEO says that I want to invest $3 million more in product development than you're comfortable with. Help me understand your concern. The CFO says that my concern is cash runway. That additional $3 million investment means we have 14 months of runway instead of 17 months. If growth doesn't materialize as planned, we will need to raise earlier than I would like, potentially at unfavorable terms. Fair response. So the CEO says, I hear that. Great response now. And here's my perspective. Without that product investment, we won't be competitive in the enterprise segment. And that is a strategic priority, by the way. I'd rather take the cash risk than the strategic risk of falling behind competitively. You get the framing that is going on right now between these two folks? So what if we face it differently, says the CFO? What if we invest $1.5 million in Q1 and Q2, then assess whether we are tracking to plan before committing to the other $1.5 million? That gives us a little bit more optionality, don't you think? The CEO scratches his head and says, you know what? I can live with that. Let's plan it that way. Notice what happened. They acknowledged a disagreement. They explained their perspectives and they found a middle ground that they both could equally support. And then they presented that decision to the team as a unified plan, not as a compromise between competing views. So let me close this chapter. The CEO CFO partnership and planning sets a tone for the entire organization. When the function leaders, they see the CEO and CFO working as true partners, aligned on strategic priorities, collaborative in problem solving, and unified in decision making, it creates confidence and it creates commitment. And when they see the CEO and the CFO pulling in different directions, well, it creates a high level of confusion. And it allows people to avoid accountability by playing one against the other. In our top-down and bottom-up planning series, I just talked about the methods and the processes in the other set of videos. But all these methods fail if the CEO CFO partnership is not strong. Get the partnership right, and everything else will become possible. The next session, we'll talk about the hardest part of planning, dealing with impasse, where top-down targets and the bottom-up capacity, they do not seem to reconcile. So I'll show how CEO and CFO work together to navigate these situations and find productive paths forward. Thank you. The next session is going to be very interesting. Looking forward to seeing you there. Bye-bye.